Welcome, we're joined from Washington, D.C. by Zarine Kharasyan. She is the Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. We'll be discussing disinformation campaigns in Armenia and media restrictions. Zarine, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So to start off, the Economic Intelligence Unit's annual Democracy Index came out recently, in which Armenia dropped 3 points. In the report, they spotlighted martial law as being a mechanism that kind of stifled freedom of expression. So I want to understand what you think about what role the war played in terms of media freedom and what you think about the government's handling of this.
I do think, of course, one component of the martial law enacted by the government is, of course, the restriction placed on media freedom. So the war, without a doubt, just objectively did have an impact on media freedom. I think the question now is whether that is going to be a temporary impact, and or if it's going to have sort of a long tail and continue past the war. And I think it's a bit unclear now. And I also think that there is essentially, amid the restrictions on media freedom, there was this creation of an information vacuum where people could really only rely on official sources, but alongside those official sources, in the absence of really established media reporting from the front lines, there was also this proliferation of anonymous Telegram channels that were responsible for spreading content. So on one hand, there were restrictions on media freedom, but those restrictions did not necessarily limit the spread of disinformation during the war and may have even exacerbated it.
And as you mentioned, during the war, one of the martial law provisions was that the media outlets in Armenia had to base their news on official statements coming from the government. Many people believe that this led to the public being misled about the events of the war and led to many people getting shocked by the outcome of the war. Do you have anything you would say about what the government should have done differently?
I do think that even during wartime, independent media serves as a watchdog of the government, and it's important for any democratic government to respect that role. So I think even amid restrictions in wartime, there are things that the government can do to work with media and allow established vetted journalists access to the front lines, especially local journalists. That can be done by having a transparent program where certain journalists are embedded along the front lines. It can also take the form of regular press briefings through a public spokesperson. I think one of the problems was that local journalists were sort of scrambling to get information from social media in the absence of official communication to them from the administration.
But on the other hand, do you not think that if there was media freedom and journalists could do as they pleased, and there was open reporting about, for example, Armenian military defeats, wouldn't that have its own problems?
I think, interestingly, well, there was a lot of international coverage of the war as well, and there were international journalists on the ground, and most people watching that coverage could see that Armenia was not doing particularly well over the course of the war. So I don't think in this day and age it's really possible for any government, when we're so connected, especially when there's a diaspora, to really be able to exact complete information control and suppression. And the Armenian government was, I think, not particularly interested in doing that, and also did not do that to that degree. I don't think the question was one of public morale, but I think any restrictions on media freedom during an armed conflict should be focused on preventing classified information that, if made public, could put the lives of soldiers or civilians at risk, because there's a compelling national security interest to do that. So a certain degree of restriction on media reporting, I think, is to be expected, and is something many democratic countries employ in war zones. But they also have these established transparent processes for embedding established journalists on the front lines, which I think could have, Armenia has some space to develop further.
And can you explain to our watchers what a disinformation campaign is? And in recent months, we've seen many examples of disinformation campaigns in Armenia. One was that the Armenian government was going to dissolve the Artsakh Defense Army. Another, that huge swathes of the region of Sunik were going to be handed over to Azerbaijan. Why is this occurring, and what do you think when you see these disinformation campaigns being circulated in the Armenian community?
I would define a disinformation campaign as a coordinated and concerted effort to spread disinformation in order to reach a particular strategic outcome or agenda. And disinformation campaigns like this, they can really be steered by a variety of actors. It's not just state actors. It's both state and non-state actors, both foreign and domestic actors, and for diverse strategic goals. They can be political, ideological, financially motivated. There's now proliferation worldwide of PR firms that are engaging in essentially disinformation as a service, or a mix of all of these motivations. And the most difficult thing, I think, about countering disinformation campaigns is that the campaigns do not have to consist solely of falsehood. They often do mix outright falsehood with truthful information that is presented in a distorted or misleading context, or that overall, over time, presents a particular worldview. So I think it's important to distinguish between that activity and misinformation, which is false information spread without this component of intent. So, for example, your grandmother posting online a home remedy about COVID would fall into this category. And the remedies for these two are different, because you can't really punish people who are unwittingly spreading false info, but you can punish people that are spreading disinformation.
So do you not think, though, at the same time, in this online era, there isn't much, especially in the context of Armenia, that can be done about disinformation campaigns? And many believe in Armenia that a lot of these campaigns are being directed from abroad, not from within Armenia. So do you think there is much that can be done about this?
I actually think that there are several things that can be done to counter disinformation campaigns. In fact, there's a role for government to play, technologies to play, and civil society to play. The challenge is that for it to really work, all of these components must work together, even when their objectives might not ultimately align. So, in my view, Armenia's vibrant civil society is one of its best defenses against disinformation, and largely it has been doing its job and then some. One thing that gets forgotten in discussions of disinformation now, when the focus is really on disinformation in the context of armed conflict, is that civil society, specifically local NGOs, especially defending LGBT and women's rights, are on the front lines of both the state-sponsored foreign and domestic disinformation campaigns, as well as coordinated harassment. So I know that Right Side NGO, for example, a local Armenian NGO that defends trans rights in Armenia, has produced several quite comprehensive monitoring reports on coordinated hate speech and disinfo in Armenia targeting the LGBT community that I think can serve as a model for a lot of civil society in terms of how civil society can monitor, document, as well as counter these campaigns. And the issue there for activists is that it's really, disinformation can really become a matter of personal safety because online violence can very easily turn into offline violence. I think the primary role that government plays should be, I would describe it as a present but reserved one. So the government should refrain from using the specter of fake news as a political cudgel to go after political opponents, even if those opponents are spreading disinformation, because selectively pursuing them in the absence of this of a regulatory framework for countering disinformation gives the impression that government counter disinfo initiatives are politically motivated, and that is one of the easiest ways to discredit these efforts. So I think there's the Armenian government's primary role in these counter disinformation efforts should be that. I also think government does have a role in providing the legal and regulatory framework in which disinformation can be addressed, which is very different from criminalizing disinformation without any sort of legal framework or protections for categories of people in place. The actual laws on the book in Armenia to counter disinformation as well as hate speech are really inadequate, and this is not a problem that is unique to Armenia. It's a problem other countries are experiencing, as well as our interconnectedness in the internet age accelerates and the law lags behind. But for example, one of the biggest areas where I see a need for improvement is the clarification of definitions of, on one hand, hate speech, and on the other hand, disinformation, because too often the two are conflated when really they require completely different approaches.
And finally, I want to ask what you think about social media's role in all of this. Some believe that many Armenian government figures have set a precedence by constantly using platforms like Facebook to release government statements and kind of make speeches. Do you think it's time for social media and the Armenian government to divorce?
I think in 2018, the penchant for Facebook Lives was refreshing because it was seen as this honest and direct way to communicate with the public. But Armenian politicians' over-reliance on social media for official communication, as we've seen, has these huge vulnerabilities because social media is ephemeral and it's optimized for engagement. So that is not the place for to communicate official directives. If established media outlets and reporters are scrambling to figure out what the government is trying to communicate to the public from trawling Armenian official social media, rather than having a proper public affairs office with a press pool that provides regular briefings to journalists, then that's a problem. As I said earlier, I think independent media has an integral role as a watchdog of government, and any democratic government should respect that role and work to support it rather than circumvent it.
Well, Zarina, thank you very much for your time again.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.